Let's talk about The Other by Thomas Tryon. I hope you enjoyed this book as much as I like it. It is just such a cool book. I really love that twist. And I hope that you did too. Okay, now I know that this is on the webpage, but spoiler alert, spoiler alert! Don't view this video until after you finish reading the novel, please. If you do, you're going to find out things that'll really harm your enjoyment of the novel, and I don't want that to happen. So if you haven't finished the novel yet, stop watching this video and go and finish the novel. Okay, the sources for this presentation are Gina Whisker and Andrew J. Weber. And full bibliographic information for both of those authors is on the Masterworks cited page for this course. Evil twin and the evil twin concept plays an important role in a lot of horror works. In some works, the good twin is stalked by the evil twin and maybe even threatened, hurt, or killed by the evil twin. In others, it's simply a matter of the good twin being blamed for horrors that are committed by the evil twin. In some, all the characters know that both twins exist, and in others, no one knows about the existence of the evil twin. Sometimes not even the good twin knows, especially if we're dealing with a separated at birth situation. So, by manipulating these and other elements, an author can create or heighten the horror in a work. But The Other is different from a lot of evil twin horrors because all of the characters except Niles know something that the reader doesn't know until late in the story. And that, of course, is that Holland has actually died before the action of the novel takes place in the summer of 1935. In fact, Holland's death is the major cause for the actions that take place in the story. We learn when he was alive that Holland was not a very good kid, although most of his unsavory acts are more hinted at than described or discussed in detail. But it's the shock of his death and Niles's unwillingness to accept it that push Niles over the edge to the point where he commits multiple murders, which of course he believes are committed by Holland. The beauty of this novel, to a large degree, and a mark of Tryon's skill as an author, is that the reader is convinced, until the big reveal, that Holland is alive and is murdering people. One aspect that might be a factor in The Other is the twins' ages. The twins have celebrated their 13th birthdays in March 1935, and the action takes place that following summer, the summer of 1935. As we know from our discussion of domestic horror, teenagers are often central to it because they're in a liminal space. Just to quickly review, a liminal space is a phase of life or an area of transition that is on the border between two states. In the case of teenagers, they're in a liminal space between childhood and adulthood. And we see this in The Other. Niles is clearly depicted as playing the games that a child would play. But some of his thoughts have a more mature flavor. Particularly, the things he says as Holland seem to be more cynical and therefore a little more mature than the actions and thoughts of the sweet, innocent Niles. Now, this gets a little complicated, and don't worry if you have trouble following it. I'm bringing this up as something that's kind of interesting and something that you can kind of play with in your mind, because I think it's pretty cool, but it's kind of complex too. Niles, and in a way even Holland, are in liminal spaces throughout the novel other than just being teenagers. At the end of the novel, we learn that the 48-year-old narrator, who comments on the action of the novel throughout the book, identifies himself as Holland, although, of course, we know that, at least physically, he's actually Niles, because Holland is long dead. But throughout most of the novel, which deals with Niles at the age of 13, Niles can be seen as being in a liminal space between being the Niles who lived prior to Holland's death, that sweet, innocent, adorable boy, and in actually being Holland. We see him act as Niles, obviously. But we know after finishing the novel that he has also acted as Holland. Since Niles eventually, at least in his own mind, becomes Holland by the time that he's the narrator in the mental institution some 35 years later, it can be argued that that summer of 1935 is a liminal space during which Niles becomes Holland. And Niles is in transition from being Niles to being Holland. So sometimes he's Niles, and sometimes he's Holland. And in a weird way, Holland can even be said to be in a liminal space. And in that case, it would be the liminal space between non-existence and existence. He's dead. So he doesn't exist. And see if you can follow this. Because Niles acts as Holland, it could be argued that the essence of Holland, his views, his wishes, his thoughts, his personality, those things that make Holland a distinct individual, his essence lives on through Niles. Now, as we've already noted, at the end of the novel, the remaining twin identifies himself as Holland. And it could be argued that the narrator's cynicism more closely aligns with the darkness that was part of the essence of Holland when he was alive, more closely than it aligns with the sweet innocence that has always been a part of the essence of Niles. Following me? Therefore, even though Holland is actually dead, it could be argued that the essential personality of Holland, that core thing that makes Holland an individual, is in a liminal space between non-existence and existence in the summer of 1935. Now, like I said, those are kind of complex thoughts, and they might seem kind of out there. Don't worry if they aren't very clear to you. You can enjoy and understand the novel just fine without them. But it is an interesting aspect of the novel that you can kind of play with in your mind every now and then. Okay, there are many ways to view any fictional work or any piece of art. And one of the ways that the other can be viewed as a doppelganger story. So let's look at what a doppelganger is. First of all, a doppelganger is completely a literary device that doesn't actually occur in the real world. It's somewhat similar to dissociative identity disorder, which we also call multiple personality disorder, but it's different in some key ways. Now, first of all, the term doppelganger is sometimes used to refer to two characters in a work that are both actually alive, but they are like the opposite sides of a coin. They might have a lot in common, but they're opposites in some way that is significant to the story. Now, one thing that you have to understand is that doppelganger literature is not always horror literature. Sometimes it is, but it's not always. Other kinds of literature also incorporate doppelgangers. For example, you might encounter a work where there are two sisters. And one becomes a glamorous, outgoing movie star, while the other is a shy, introverted woman who is a librarian. They might have a lot in common. Certainly they had their childhood in common, and the parts of their personality that were influenced by their family of origin they would have in common, as well as a lot of traits that might be genetic. But they're different in some way that is central to the action of the story. Now, in horror, quite often, the doppelganger doesn't actually exist as a separate person, but is only a creation in the mind of another character. The character who is real in terms of the narrative is the creating character, and the character who doesn't actually exist is the doppelganger. The most famous literary doppelganger is seen in the novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. In that book, only Dr. Jekyll is an actual living person. He creates and drinks a potion that frees him from the restraints of societal expectations and allows him to become this disreputable character that is known as Mr. Hyde. But Hyde isn't really a separate character with his own existence and his own body that is separate from Dr. Jekyll. He is a creation. Jekyll is the creating character, and Hyde is the doppelganger. Similarly, in the summer of 1935, which is the period when the majority of the action in the novel takes place, Holland is dead and does not actually exist as a separate character. He is created in Niles's mind. So Niles is the creating character, and Holland is the doppelganger. Now, according to Weber, doppelgangers have visual, auditory, and performance components. In other words, the doppelganger is seen, heard, and acts separately from the creating character. In some cases, only the creating character sees and hears the doppelganger, but usually the doppelganger carries out actions that have very real effects on other characters in the story. Another thing that Weber tells us about doppelgangers is that the creating character is often the product of a broken or dysfunctional home, and that contributes to the creation of the doppelganger. And quite often, the doppelganger and the creating character are seen to be in a power struggle of some sort. They're seen to be in conflict, and sometimes they actually are in conflict over who is in charge of the only body that they share. Let's talk specifically about the visual component of the doppelganger in The Other. As we've stated, according to Weber, the doppelganger usually has a visual component. And in most literary works, the creating character actually sees and interacts with the doppelganger, even if other characters don't. Certainly, we see this in The Other. Niles continues to see Holland throughout the summer of 1935, and that's the summer after Holland's death. And in fact, Niles continues to see Holland even after we readers know that Holland is dead. One of the interesting things is that Niles often comments on Holland's eyebrows and his smile, which were two traits that were in very minor ways different in the physicality between these two identical twins when Holland was alive. And because Niles comments on these physical characteristics that were different in Holland, we know that Niles is seeing Holland. He's not simply seeing a reflection of himself, although reflections obviously play a big part in The Other. Now, as Weber says, other characters might not see the doppelganger at all, Or if they do, the doppelganger might not look at all like the creating character. For example, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, other characters do see Mr. Hyde, but he looks completely different than Dr. Jekyll because he's created through a potion that creates physical changes in the character. While in the other, Niles is the only character who sees Holland, although the reader is led to believe that other characters see him. It's only when we read the novel a second time that we notice that nobody in the book sees Holland in the summer of 1935 except Niles. Now, as Weber says, this visual component adds ambiguity, and the reader is often confused as to how many characters there actually are and which one is performing various actions. And we definitely see that in Tryon's 1971 novel. In fact, Tryon capitalizes on the ambiguity inherent in the visual component of doppelganger literature in writing this book. As horrific as the murders are, the true horror for the reader, I think, comes when we learn that Holland has been dead since before the action of the novel begins. When we first read the novel, it appears that other characters see Holland. We see Mrs. Rowe interacting with Holland, for example. But what we don't recognize is, or see the first time we read it, is that the only person that Niles really talks to about Holland's activities of that summer is Ada. And Ada, we learn, is playing along with Niles' belief that Holland hasn't died. But we don't notice that, because Niles does talk about Holland to other characters, such as his mother, Alexandra. But on an initial read, something that we don't notice is that when he mentions Holland to other characters, it's usually just in passing, which often elicits an odd look from the other characters, or it's about something very general that people could think referred to Holland when he was alive. For example, when Aunt V asks if Russell can borrow, can use Niles's bike, Niles says, well, it's broken down, but he can use Holland's. It's in the garage. Well, that doesn't say that Holland is alive. But because Niles talks to Aunt V about Holland, there's almost an implication that Holland still exists. And that's one of the ways that Tryon capitalizes on the ambiguity of the doppelganger and the ambiguity of the visual component of the doppelganger. Niles sees Holland. It's so easy to get those names mixed up, even though they don't sound alike. Niles sees Holland at Russell's funeral. But it's only when we go back and reread that passage that we see that nobody else sees Holland. That only Niles sees that he's there. And only Niles interacts with him, and that's only through a hand signal. He doesn't actually talk to Holland when other people are at the funeral and other people are around. Now, yeah, Mrs. Rowe thinks she sees Holland. As we talked about, she thinks it's Holland that comes to her house and scares her with the rat, and, that leads to her heart attack and kills her. But Mrs. Rowe is a very confused old woman. But Tryon uses that to increase the ambiguity in the novel. The ambiguity for readers is what creates the possibility for that twist that makes this novel so good. Now, according to Weber, the creating character and the doppelganger usually talk to each other. But there are exceptions, of course. Mr. Hyde exists only after Dr. Jekyll drinks the potion. And at that point, Dr. Jekyll no longer exists. So, in cases like that, the two clearly can't communicate. But most often, we see situations that are more similar to what we see in the other. Niles and Holland communicate, but when we read it through a second time, we notice that they only communicate when there's no one else within earshot. But Tryon manipulates that so that we don't notice it. For example, when Russell catches the twins in the apple cellar and he sees that Niles has the Peregrine for Perry ring, it appears that Holland simply moves into the shadows and becomes quiet. But since Niles is the one that Russell catches with the ring, and the one that Niles talks to, it doesn't strike us as strange that Holland doesn't say anything. Besides, we already know that early in the book that Holland doesn't like Russell. So the fact that Holland doesn't talk to Russell doesn't strike us as strange on that initial read-through at all. In fact, we probably don't even notice it when we first read it. But when we reread it, we notice that Niles and Holland talk only until Russell arrives. And then after Russell leaves, Niles and Holland talk again. So they don't actually say anything to each other when there's anybody else around. That's one of the ways that Tryon increases the ambiguity that leads to the big surprise when readers learn that Holland is dead. Now, Weber also states that doppelgangers usually arise from internal conflict, so the creating character and the doppelganger often disagree. Niles and Holland disagree from the very beginning, often in very minor ways, sometimes, although usually unspoken, in much more significant ways. For example, going back to Russell finding the twins in the apple cellar, or finding Niles in the apple cellar with the ring. Niles is very worried about what's going to happen because Russell says he's going to tell. And Niles isn't supposed to have the ring. It's supposed to be Holland's. We already know that. So Niles is very worried about what's going to happen, because we know that there's some secret about this ring. And even Niles having the ring is a secret. And it's a secret that the twins share and are carefully protecting. We don't know why, but we know that there is a mystery about this ring. So Niles is very concerned about what's going to happen. Holland, on the other hand, says it's no big deal. He tells Niles not to worry about it. This is all going to work out just fine. But they're not going to get in trouble at all. Nobody's going to know that Niles has the ring. Of course, we learn later that Holland kills Russell to keep Russell from telling. And it seems clear that that means that when Holland is reassuring Niles that everything's going to be all right, Holland, or the part of Niles that is Holland, is already planning to kill Russell. But that's in conflict with what Niles would want. Niles doesn't want to be told on, but Niles has a real problem with things dying. He mourns the death of a rat to the point that he needs to bury it and hold a funeral for it. So certainly Niles has no intention of killing Russell, and yet Holland knows that he's going to kill him. So that's a disagreement between the twins. No, in this case it's not really auditory, although many of the disagreements between the twins are. But we do see that there is a conflict between Niles and Holland. And we also see that whenever Niles and Holland disagree, Holland wins. Let's talk about the performance component. Now, another aspect of the doppelganger, according to Weber, is that the doppelganger does act. There is a performance component. In most cases, the creating character sees the doppelganger as acting completely independently and separately. Certainly this is true in The Other. Holland obviously isn't around when other characters are around, and there are other times when Niles is alone and Holland isn't there. But Niles believes that Holland has hopped on the streetcar and taken a ride to Babylon, or ridden his bike into town, or that Niles simply doesn't know where Holland is, because after all, they are separate people, in Niles's view, and they operate independently. When the doppelganger lit is horror, and as I said, not all of it is, the creating character usually sees the horrific acts in the work as being performed by the doppelganger. And often, the creating character has no memory of those acts taking place at all. Certainly we see that in The Other. It's Holland who visits Mrs. Rowe in the magician costume and scares her to death. Niles doesn't even know she's dead until he hears women in the shop gossiping about it. Niles is the twin who is talking to Alexandra on the stairs after she finds the Prince Albert twin with the ring and the finger in it. But it's Holland who actually pushes her down them. Even after we readers learn that Holland is dead, Niles continues to believe that Holland is acting separately. It's Holland who has taken Tori's baby, not Niles, and Niles knows nothing about it. We know this because Niles keeps asking Holland where the baby is. Niles has no idea what's happened to that baby. He sees Holland as acting separately, and he has no memory of what Holland does when he does act separately. He suspects that Holland has taken the baby because Holland has always had a problem with the baby. But he doesn't know. And he certainly doesn't know what Holland has done with the baby, and he's as shocked as we are when that baby's body is found floating in that wine cask. So, the doppelganger is seen as acting completely separately from the creating character, who is Niles. And what the doppelganger doesn't align with the creating character's wishes, desires, and motivations. Niles doesn't want anything to happen to Tori's baby. Niles doesn't want his mother to fall down the stairs. Niles doesn't have anything against Mrs. Rowe, so he doesn't necessarily want her dead. And yeah, Niles doesn't want Russell to tell on him, but he doesn't have any desire for him to die. So it's Holland that carries out these actions, without Niles' consent or agreement. If Niles had known that Holland was going to do these things, he probably would have done everything he could to stop him. Which is a little weird considering that Niles is Holland, but you do see what I mean. Okay. And that leads us to the concept that in doppelganger literature, often the doppelganger and the creating character are in conflict. Weber tells us that the creating character is often the product of a broken home or a dysfunctional family, and that the situation in that home helps give rise to the creation of the doppelganger. The Perry family is clearly dysfunctional even before Holland dies, and that dysfunction simply increases on his death. From what we're told, when he was alive, Holland was a major source of dysfunction in the family. Now, since Niles was a child at the time these things occurred, he wasn't given a lot of details about the living Holland's misbehavior. But he does know, and so we know or are told, that there had been a number of incidents with other children, and that Holland had even been sent to see a psychiatrist. Of course, Niles knows that Holland kills his father because Niles sees him do it. Then, after Holland's death, Alexandra shuts herself in her room and leaves Niles's care to an aging grandmother who holds Russian superstitions and plays a game that is potentially dangerous, and it's especially dangerous for a young boy who has suffered a recent physical and mental collapse because his twin has died. And that change after Holland dies, Alexandra's withdrawing, and Ada's stepping in as Niles' major caregiver, that simply increases the dysfunction in the family. Now, furthermore, as Weber states, the doppelganger is often created as a result of strong internal conflict within the creating character. And as a result, Weber says, the visual, auditory, and performance aspects of the doppelganger often create conflicts between the creating character and the doppelganger, as we discussed, and there is a power struggle between the two as to whose wishes will be followed. Now, as we've already talked about, Holland acts in ways that Niles finds as horrific as we do. And Holland was the dominant twin when he was alive. He always called Niles little brother, even though the only reason that Niles' birthday is one day later than Holland's is because midnight happened to occur between the two births. And then after he dies, it's obvious that Holland controls the shared body quite often if the twins disagree on a course of action. Because these people do end up dead, even though it's not what Holland would want. And by the time the twin in the mental institution narrates this tale and comments on it 35 years after the events occur, Holland is the only twin alive. We know this because he tells us that he won't associate with other patients because they refuse to call him by his correct name, which is Holland. One way this novel can be viewed is that Niles is so enthralled with Holland, and Holland is so dominant in their relationship when Holland is alive, that Niles essentially lays down his life so that Holland can live. No, we're not talking about physical life here. The physical body that continues to exist is Niles' physical body. But the essence of the person, that thing that makes a person an individual, separate from the physical aspect, the personality, the wishes, the motivations, the desires, the worldview, the attitude, all of those things, in this narrator who is alive 35 years after the events of the novel, they all align with Holland's personality. And the twin believes he is Holland. So in terms of the essence of a person, and what makes a person, the twin that is alive at the end of the novel is Holland, and the twin who has died is Niles, which is obviously a reversal of the truth. Okay. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope that it helps increase your enjoyment and understanding of the novel. If you have any questions, of course, don't hesitate to email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.oki@csn.edu. Thanks again. Hope you have a great day, and we'll get together and talk again soon.